call the Committee on Transportation Infrastructure to order. Pursuant to Committee Rule 6F, Rule 11-2H4, the Chair may postpone further proceedings to any question approving any measurement or matter, adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote of the ayes and nays are ordered, and without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Today, the committee will consider, do I really have to read all the bills? Why can't we just say we're going to consider a number of bills? And,
okay, that's fine. Number of bills and use an estimate.
okay, we are going to consider a number of bills. I'm not going to read them all because we will get to them all later. As a reminder, keep your microphones off unless you are acknowledged and addressing the committee. If you're remote, to insert a document to the record, please have your staff email at the documents tni@mail.house.gov. And finally, all bill and amendment text has been distributed electronically in accordance with the rules. I now call up our first item for consideration today, the committee's fiscal year 2023 views and estimates. Ask unanimous consent they be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize myself for an opening statement. Today, we are considering the committee's fiscal year 2023 views and estimates as required by House Rules, Congressional Budget Act of 1974. I want to thank Ranking Member Graves, all our colleagues in the minority, working collaboratively with us. We may not all necessarily agree on everything included, but this represents a general bipartisan framework from which we can all work. In this document, we've laid out many of our committee goals for this year, which include, among other things, Coast Guard authorization, Water Resources Development Act, Economic Development Administration authorization, National Transportation Safety Board authorization. Another top priority is to continue overseeing timely implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure law, and that will provide billions of dollars to modernize our national highway and transit and rail systems. This funding will improve roads, bridges, focus on climate change, mitigation, resilience, equity, safety for all users, provide healthy, sustainable transportation for millions of Americans, build a network of electronic vehicle charges to facilitate long-distance travel, and provide convenient charging options to help connect every American to reliable, high-speed internet, and much more. These are investments that have been years in pending, and it is long overdue. Americans are tired of potholes that blow out their tires. They're tired of bridges that collapse. They're tired of sewers that back up and water that comes out of the tap they can't drink. It's heartening to see the committee has a lot of areas of mutual interest and plenty of common ground. And in my remaining time here, I look forward to working with all our members on behalf of the American people to deliver on investments and improve the lives of every community in this country. And I recognize Ranking Member Graves for his statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This year, the committee continues to have a packed agenda, and we have to ensure that the infrastructure laws funds are implemented in accordance with the letter of the law and the best interests of the taxpayers. Whether members voted for the infrastructure bill or not, the fact is that a massive amount of money is going to be spent in the coming years, and with record levels of inflation, ongoing supply chain delays, and other issues, those infrastructure dollars simply aren't going to be able to go as far as they would have before this crisis. So while our oversight duties are always important, oversight is now more critical than ever. And our views and estimates document lays out our legislative goals for this Congress, including a Water Resources Development Act, and I do appreciate the Chair working with us on it, and I urge my colleagues to support the views and estimates for fiscal year 2023. Yield back.
I thank gentlemen. Any other members wish to be recognized to make statements on the views and estimates? Hearing none. Are there any amendments to the fiscal year 2023 budget views and estimates? Hearing none. The question is now on adoption of the fiscal year 2023 budget views and estimates of the Community and Transportation and Infrastructure. All those in favor, unmute, signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Okay, mute. Unmute for those who want to say nay. Hearing none, the ayes have it. Our views and estimates are adopted. Pursuant to Rule 10, Clause 4F, the views and estimates of the Community Transportation Infrastructure will be submitted to the Committee on the Budget. Next item for consideration is H.R. 5315, the Drone Infrastructure Inspection Grant Act. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Aviation is discharged from further consideration of H.R. 5315, and I call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I believe that Representative Stanton has an amendment in the nature of substitute. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5315, offered by Mr. Stanton, number 010.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of substitute shall be considered as read and shall be considered base text for purposes of further amendment. I now recognize Rep. Stanton for a statement on his amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for including this common sense bipartisan legislation in today's markup. All of us on this committee know that our country has to do a better job of inspecting infrastructure. There's a nationwide backlog, and it's because traditional methods of inspecting critical infrastructure are often time-consuming, dangerous, and expensive. Inspections are essential, and we have seen tragic results across the country when structural flags go unnoticed. A bridge collapses, a levee breaks, and innocent people are injured or killed as a result. Modern technology has given us a great tool that we can use for inspections: drones. Using a drone to inspect infrastructure in hard-to-reach places, such as underneath bridges, can speed up the inspection process so that we can get through the backlog more quickly, and it can help save money as well. In fact, the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials estimate that utilizing drones reduces the cost of infrastructure by 74%, and the time needed to conduct the inspection by 88%. Not only that, but drone inspections are much safer for workers than having a human hang under a tall bridge. It's an easy way to improve on-the-job safety. A number of cities, tribes, and state departments of transportation already use drones for these inspections. In my state, the Arizona Department of Transportation has been using drones to inspect hard-to-reach areas on bridges and survey areas near highways where falling rocks or ground movements are potential hazards. Drones have collected photos and other information across a large survey area while keeping the traveling public safe and their staff out of harm's way. What this bill does is simple. It gives states, tribes, and local governments the opportunity to use drones. It creates competitive grants to purchase, contract for services, or develop program, operational, or management capability for American-made small unmanned aircraft systems to perform critical infrastructure inspections, maintenance, operations, and repair projects. And it provides federal resources to train the next generation and upskill our existing workforce to capitalize on this fast-growing drone economy. The substitute amendment makes a number of changes to the bill to reflect technical assistance we have received from the Department of Transportation. It clarifies the definition of critical infrastructure project, elements of critical infrastructure, and governmental entity. It clarifies that grant funds can be used to contract for services only if the governmental entity does not have the resources or expertise to safely carry out or assist in carrying out the eligible activities, and defines covered foreign entity. I want to thank Representative Garrett Graves for being a great partner on this legislation, as well as his outstanding staff member, Maggie Aaim, who worked very closely with my team every step of the way, from initial drafting to the changes included in this amendment. This is the first time that I've had the fortune to work with the gentleman from Louisiana, and I appreciate the thoughtful approach and perspective that he brought to this bill. And I also want to express my thanks, a deep appreciation, to the committee staff, Alexandra Minardi, Brian Bell, and Hunter Presti, who have worked diligently over the past several months on these modifications and improvements to the bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your support, and I urge my colleagues to support the amendment. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Now to recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not going to belabor it too much, but H.R. 5315 ensures that our workforce has the tools and resources to successfully deploy all of these technologies. This legislation, it builds on language that was included in the 2018 FAA reauthorization and makes available funds to institutions of higher education, including community colleges, to train and educate workers on using and operating drones. In short, it's going to improve safety and it's going to reduce costs and increase efficiency through deployment of cutting-edge technologies. And I do want to thank Representative Stanton and the Aviation Subcommittee Ranking Member Garrett Graves for the work on this bill. and their leadership in facilitating the use of innovative technologies in our communities all across the country. So I would urge my colleagues to support the bill and yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Now recognize myself for a brief statement. I had the privilege to travel to Phoenix in Representative Stanton's district and witness a drone inspection of a large section of flyover on an interstate. It would have taken days if for people working off of hoists or however else they would have gotten underneath that bridge to look at the expansion joints and the other issues, looking for spalling or any other problems. So this is a bill that will both improve safety on the ground, with the ongoing inspection of our existing infrastructure, watching for points of failure. And it also assures us that the drones will be used properly and safely to protect the national airspace, and it'll save taxpayers a lot of money. So I strongly support the bill. And with that, I recognize Ranking Member Graves of the subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 5315, the Drone Infrastructure Inspection Grant Act, addresses major problems in infrastructure. And we've had, for many years now, the American Society of Civil Engineers has come out and rated all these various forms of transportation as being deficient, as being an F grade, a D grade, and clearly not meeting the needs of our communities. My home state of Louisiana, we have around 3,000 miles of levees. And as Mr. Stanton noted, the failures of levees we experienced, or at least the flood walls we experienced in Hurricane Katrina, can have devastating consequences in that instance. As a result of that and other failures, we lost over 1,500 of our fellow citizens. We have seen in Mr. Crawford's area the bridge connecting Tennessee and Arkansas. We've seen bridges in Minneapolis and Atlanta, Washington State, and other places that have collapsed. There is a backlog. 42% of the bridge, as of last year, 42% of bridges in the United States were over 50 years old. There's a backlog in inspections, there's a backlog in maintenance and updates, and this helps, one, to improve safety by ensuring that we can quickly get out there and more safely, rather than having somebody roped up in a harness hanging off a bridge, we can get drones out there using new technology, cheaper, safer, and helping to identify deficiencies in bridges and other infrastructure to where we can address those deficiencies, address those maintenance needs much faster. This is simply not a scenario where we can continue dumping money into it. There are worker shortages. The amount of money that it would cost to address the backlog is overwhelming, and this helps to improve the efficiency of addressing those inspection backlogs that are out there. I think that Mr. Graves and Chairman DeFazio and Mr. Stanton covered the rest of this, so I'm just going to say I do want to thank Mr. Stanton. I want to thank Mr. Larson, DeFazio, and Ranking Member Graves for their assistance here. I do want to thank Tracy Sutton for all of her work in working with Maggie and our team, and Hunter, you don't get all the credit. We'll give a shout out to Laney and Jamie and Chris as well, everybody for helping to put this bill together. I urge adoption of the legislation and yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. I understand that Representative Titus, Chair of the Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management Subcommittee, wishes to be recognized at this point. Representative Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the co-chair with Mr. Garrett Graves of the Unmanned Aircraft Systems Caucus, I'm proud to support this bill, and I thank him for his leadership, as well as Mr. Stanton. Look forward to voting for its passage. UAS technology has become an important element of our aviation system, and it's leveraged every day in Nevada to safely and more effectively inspect our state's infrastructure, whether it's bridges, roads, dams, or power lines. I'm in strong support of this legislation, which will make significant investments to support critical infrastructure inspections, provide opportunities for Nevada companies to partner with local governments on these efforts, and develop a workforce that will be ready to meet the demand. So again, I thank the sponsors and those worked on it, and it's a pleasure to work with Mr. Garrett on the caucus, we had a roundtable yesterday discussing some of these very issues. So I urge my colleagues to support the legislation. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Do other members wish to be recognized? Hearing none, we'll move on to amendments. Are there amendments to the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I've got an amendment.
Okay, the clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 5315, number 1, offered by Mr. Perry, number 600.
The amendment is considered as read, and I recognize Mr. Perry to speak on his amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. According to several industry groups, drone infrastructure inspections show great potential to drastically reduce both inspection cost and timelines. And I don't find myself in disagreement with any of the things that have been said so far by the makers of the bill and the issue at hand. In 2017, PricewaterhouseCoopers estimated the total market value for infrastructure drone solutions at $45 billion, and an AASHTO survey found that 29 state DOTs report cost savings thanks to drones. So it's no surprise that state DOTs have embraced drone operations. According to AASHTO's executive director, in 3 short years, we've gone from 0 to 36 state DOTs executing drone missions internally. Now, given this seemingly promising market for drone infrastructure field, it's unclear to me why taxpayers in anybody's district need to pay for drone inspection and drone workforce training grants. These are grants, ladies and gentlemen. In addition, if the cost savings to engineering firms and municipalities is so significant, and it is, any costs incurred for workforce training or program implementation ought to be quickly recouped. I mean, that's just generally how businesses operate. They look at their return on investment, they see if it's worth it, and they make the investment. And this clearly meets anybody that's doing this work. And I've worked, my father-in-law is an engineer, my brother and sister-in-law are engineers. I've worked in engineering companies. This actually and absolutely fits the mold for the private industry to invest in it. Now, this amendment would strike 2 unnecessary grant programs and insert a provision to exempt drones conducting critical infrastructure inspections from beyond visual line of sight requirements. We've all been here for a long time, and we all know that this fact is hindering the ability, and the navigation system that the FAA refuses to produce timely. It's not grant programs that are going to save this and make this usable. It's deregulating things that are hampering the industry. Instead of spending even more money we don't have, paradoxically, to fund a more cost-effective process, let's lower the regulatory barriers that are keeping the private sector from fully utilizing this new avenue to conduct their inspections. And I don't know if this is a newsflash to anybody here, but we are woefully in debt in the United States of America. We don't have any of this money. It doesn't exist. And the private sector will do it if we just let them. So I would just urge my colleagues to support this amendment. I agree with the premise of the bill, just not how it's funded, and I don't think we need to do that. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you, gentlemen. I understand Representative Titus wishes to speak to the amendment Recognized. Dina, you still there? Okay. Okay. I recognize myself for such time as I may consume. This amendment would exempt the use of small drones and critical infrastructure from federal requirements for visual line of sight operations. Just a few weeks ago, and I haven't read it yet, I don't think staff has either, FAA's BVLOS, Beyond Visual Line of Sight, Aviation Rulemaking Committee released a 400-page report and recommendations for potential beyond a visual line of sight drone operations. This amendment would assume that all of the safety issues outlined and concerns and in that report are not necessary, and I would suggest that the committee would want to actually digest the 400-page report before we go beyond it, because our premier responsibility here as regards the airspace of the United States, including the operation of drones, is the safety of that airspace. So with that, I would oppose the amendment. Do other members wish to be recognized? Representative Garrett Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, first of all, I want to say that Mr. Perry did hit on a topic that is very relevant. And as my friend and co-chair on the UAV caucus noted, we had a long meeting yesterday with a number of drone stakeholders. BVLOS, or beyond visual line of sight, is a key issue. It is something that is absolutely, among a number of other issues, it is holding back the potential for unmanned systems, for drone technology, and for all the conveniences and safety that can be advanced as a result. And I appreciate the gentleman from Pennsylvania raising this issue. Because, let me say it again, I don't think the FAA has moved forward with this with the urgency it deserves. This is a fundamental issue or impediment to allowing us to maximize the potential of unmanned systems. But I am opposing this amendment, and I want to say why. Coming in and just expressly saying that we're getting rid of all beyond visual line of sight, BVLOS requirements. You have all sorts of other things that are in the airspace, in the national airspace. You have in my home state, we have thousands of helicopters that fly every single week out into the offshore. We have airplanes. The United States has some of the most complex airspace in the world. Look, I'll beat up on the previous administration. I'll beat up on this one. Remote ID, the rulemaking took way too long. It's imperfect. That was one step forward. BVLOS is another one. The type cert, the organizational structure, none of it is going to allow for us to take advantage of this new technology. We're out there using a type cert process that's designed for 737s, and they come out one per week whenever we're going to be seeing tens of thousands of drones coming out in a week, and it's wholly incapable. So let me say it again. My friend from Pennsylvania is right in raising this issue, but I do think that we, from a safety perspective, if we're going to take advantage of this, we must make sure that these unmanned systems are properly integrated into the airspace. Otherwise, we're going to have some catastrophic incident that's going to result in years and years of setbacks in our ability to take advantage of this technology. So as aviation ranker, and I'm sure Mr. Larson would make the same commitment, Mr. Perry, we would both be more than willing to work with you on this. I think it's a concern that both of us have, but I think that just coming in and making a blanket waiver with no safety protocols or allowance for integration into the national airspace would likely result in major safety or interaction issues with general or commercial aviation, resulting in the death of Americans, and I can't support that at this time. Yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Do other members wish to be recognized on the amendment to the amendment?
Mr. Chair.
Recognize the chair of the Aviation Subcommittee, Mr. Larson.
I'll be brief and just want to underscore what Representative Graves' comments were, what he said. We're still, in many ways, if we're in a crawl, walk, run mode, somewhere between crawling and walking in terms of integrating drones in the airspace, integrating other new entrants in the airspace. It is frustratingly slow for many. I understand that very, very clearly, but I do think that it is important that we do this integration in a deliberate manner. The amendment, unfortunately, undermines that, and so I'd encourage folks to vote against it. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Do others wish to be heard on the amendment to the amendment? Hearing none, then the question is on the amendment to the amendment. Prepare yourselves. All those in favor of the amendment to the amendment will signify by saying aye. All those opposed will signify by saying no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Noes have it, and we will move on to the next amendment. The clerk will designate the next amendment.
Amendment number 2 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5315, offered by Mr. Perry, number 593.
The gentleman is recognized for without objection, the amendment we consider it as read. I recognize Mr. Perry to speak on his amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment strikes the provision in the bill that allows the Secretary to increase the federal share up to 100%, as previously stated. Ladies and gentlemen, $30 trillion in debt. State DOTs are actually set to receive an absurd amount of federal funding over the next 5 years due to the IIJA. Moreover, the use of drones for infrastructure inspection offers significant cost-saving opportunities for the very same state DOTs. As I said before, AASHTO found 29 state DOTs report cost savings thanks to drone, in some cases up to 75% of cost saving. The market should be driving state DOTs to implement drone inspection programs absent additional federal subsidies, and it already is. Again, AASHTO's executive director said in 3 short years, we've gone from 0 to 36 states, DOTs executing drone missions internally. Given these facts, it seems wildly inappropriate and completely unnecessary to provide a grant program at all, let alone one that allows for 100% federal share, 100%. Even more concerning, the Secretary can provide a 100% federal share if the recipient submits a request that demonstrates, this is a quote, demonstrates the additional assistance is necessary to facilitate the acceptance and full use of a grant under this section, such as alleviating economic hardship, meeting additional workforce needs, or such other uses that the Secretary determines to be appropriate, which is anything. The last point means that there are no criteria whatsoever, and instead it is left completely up to the whims of the Secretary to determine the share. This amendment would eliminate these concerns by ensuring that states and localities have at least some skin in the game for these inspection programs that will seemingly provide significant returns on their investment. I urge support for the sake of fiscal sanity of this amendment, and I yield the balance, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. Are there other members who wish to be heard on the amendment to the amendment? Mr. Graves, Louisiana, recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, once again, I want to thank Mr. Perry for raising an issue, and as Mr. Stanton will tell you, this was probably the issue that held this bill up for longer than anything else in our negotiations. I share your concerns, and as you'll note in the legislation, we actually did put criteria such as demonstrating economic hardship, the inability to get workforce or other challenges that have to be demonstrated in order to qualify for a reduced cost share, number one. Number two, something else that I think is really important. This bill is authorized for 2 years. It's authorized for 2 years. This isn't in perpetuity, which we have another bill on the markup that we'll be talking about that is in perpetuity. And going back to what you said in the previous debate, and as well as covering again in this one, look, yes, there are states that are doing this. This is a new technology. It is an entirely new set of infrastructure, of workers, of everything that is needed. I have voted for every balanced budget amendment. I've voted for Freedom Caucus budgets and everything else. We need to balance the budget, but I do believe that by seeding it, SEED, but by putting some money in, helping invest for 2 years, we can get states and local governments the bandwidth, the capacity that they need to do this. I agree with you that going out there and not having any of these local and state governments with skin in the game is something that we need to pay attention to. But I will tell you that we worked very closely with Mr. Stanton. Mr. DeFazio got involved, and Alex on his staff to work with us to try and tighten this up. I think we're at a good spot now. Is it perfect? No, but I think we're at a good spot now, and I'll just tell you that I'd be happy to work with you as we move to the floor if there are ways we can further tighten this up. But I don't want to get in a situation, I don't think it makes sense for any of us to get in a situation where we're actually going to box out or prevent local governments from having access to this technology that's going to improve safety, potentially avert a major disaster or catastrophe in infrastructure. Having gone through that in my home state of Louisiana with levees, seeing it happen in other states with bridges and others, I think it's important that we don't totally impede any local government from, or state government from having access to this if it's an economic hardship. Urge rejection of the amendment and yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Do others wish to be heard? With that, I recognize myself for such time as I may consume. I would agree with Mr. Graves. Basically, we want to encourage the utilization of this. I would disagree with the representative from Pennsylvania that we're allocating an absurd amount of money. If you look at the documented needs in the annual report of the American Society of Civil Engineers, this is a record amount of money, but it's nowhere what we need to bring all of our existing infrastructure up to a state of good repair. 42,000 bridges on the national highway system. That doesn't even include local bridges, city, county. I have one county that it is not a wealthy county in my district, Douglas County. I visited there, and they have, I believe, over 80 bridges that are local bridges, providing access to the national forests for log trucks and for recreationists that need substantial repair or replacement. That's 1 out of 16,000 counties in America. So I think that we want to get this program going. We want people to get ahead of this problem. We want them to spend the money as efficiently as possible, and I think this would impede the adoption and utilization of this and finding problems before the bridges collapse. Hopefully not with anybody on them, but sometimes there are people on them when they collapse. So with that, I would oppose the amendment. Do others wish to be heard? Representative Stanton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I wanted to echo the comments of Congressman Graves and also indicate from our perspective, the main beneficiary of the program in terms of the federal dollars not requiring the matching was tribal governments. We want to make sure that tribal governments in Arizona and throughout the country had a full and fair opportunity to access technology to inspect infrastructure on their lands. And so that was the main purpose for which we did this.
Thank you, gentlemen. Others wish to be heard? Hearing none, then we would move. Are there amendments to the amendment? No. Okay. If not, the question is on the amendment. Prepare yourselves. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Okay.
Aye.
All right. All those opposed signify by saying nay.
No.
No counts too. Okay. In the opinion of the chair, the nays and noes have it. The amendment is not adopted. We would move on now. The clerk would designate the next amendment. Mr. Perry, 594, I believe.
Amendment number 3 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 5315, offered by Mr. Perry, number 594.
Gentlemen, without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on behalf of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 594 strikes instances of 50 million and inserts 12,500,000, which is a 75% reduction. Not to be a broken record here, but if these drones inspections are so revolutionary and cost-effective for both government entities and private sector, why should taxpayers across the country pay for this? Look, I agree. They are revolutionary, and they are cost-effective. I completely agree. In the spirit of compromise, instead of striking the funding levels entirely, this amendment reduces funding by 75%, the approximate cost savings for a drone-powered bridge deck inspection, according to the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, formerly known as AASHTO. So it's pretty simple. The math is simple. The logic is simple, and I just urge adoption, and again, with some eye to any level of fiscal sanity in this country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank gentlemen. Are there others? Mr. Graves, Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, once again, I have a lot of respect for the gentleman from Pennsylvania's efforts to ensure that we stay on a, use his words, a fiscally sane trajectory. I agree. I want to remind the gentleman that the authorization levels in this legislation are a cap. That's a cap. This bill does not include mandatory appropriations. This is an authorization that then would be forced to compete with all of the other appropriations requests before the Appropriations Committee. Number two, I'm going to reiterate a point I made earlier. This is an authorization for 2 years. The idea is that we seed this industry. This is a paradigm shift in regard to types of inspections that are done. And I understand the gentleman's correct that looking at numbers such as 50 million a year, it's a lot of money. But I'll also remind you, how much are the lives that were lost in Georgia? How much worth are the lives that were lost in Minnesota? How much were the lives that were lost in Louisiana? I remind you, we lost 1,500 people from Hurricane Katrina as a result of what the Corps of Engineers determined were engineering failures, man-made failures by them. And you know, if this bill authorized 50 million a year in perpetuity, I'd be with you. I would. But in this case, we've limited it significantly to a 2-year bill, 2-year authorization in order to help some of these state and local governments get the resources that they need in order to do this conversion and to hopefully address, which I think my friend Mr. Stanton's goal is to address some of the extraordinary backlog in inspections that are needed. And so while I do appreciate my friend from Pennsylvania's objective here, I urge rejection of the amendment. Yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Do others wish to be heard? Hearing none, I'd recognize myself. I understand the gentleman's concern about the deficit, but we can also look at this in a reverse way. Many counties and cities are years behind on bridge inspections. And even on the national highway system, there is a backlog on required bridge inspections. So the inverse way to look at this would be that we're going to reduce the cost significantly, benefiting taxpayers, and we can also reduce, or maybe over, I don't think we can in 2 years, eliminate the backlog of bridge inspections. I think it'll actually would take longer than that with a 75% increase in efficiency, given the basic, it would be hundreds of thousands of bridges when you include state and local off the national highway system, with the 42,000 on the national highway system. So I would oppose the gentleman's amendment. Do others wish to be heard? Hearing none, are there amendments to the amendment to the amendment? Hearing none, then the question, prepare yourselves, will be on the adoption of the amendment. Those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Okay. Those opposed will signify by saying nay.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it. The nays have it. The amendment's not agreed to. The clerk will designate the next amendment. I believe it's Perry 589.
Amendment number 4 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 5315, offered by Mr. Perry, number 589.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read and open for discussion. I would recognize the author of the amendment, Mr. Perry, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 589 reduces the federal share for inspection grants to 25% maximum. It's clear, both through discussion about this bill and industry reports, that there seem to be a consensus that the potential benefits of drone infrastructure inspections. While I don't think the federal government should be left holding the bag for any of the provisions in this bill, my amendment is a compromise that simply lowers the maximum federal share of a total project cost from 80% to 25%. Again, if drone inspections are going to save the private and public sector substantial amounts of time and money, and I think they will, there should be a few hurdles for a state and local government to secure non-federal funding. They should have some skin in the game. These exist where they are. They're their taxpayers there. And again, I think that the cost savings is significant here, and the market will drive this if we just allow it to. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance.
Thanks, gentlemen. Others, Mr. Graves, Louisiana, recognized 5 minutes on the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank gentleman from Pennsylvania for being so verbose and persistent. I think we largely killed an amendment just a few minutes ago that did almost the exact same thing here. I urge rejection of the amendment. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Others wish to be recognized. Hearing none, recognize myself briefly. I would make the same argument I made on the last amendment, which is we have a massive backlog, and these reductions in cost will help states, tribes, cities and counties begin to catch up with that backlog. With that, I would oppose the amendment. Do others wish to be recognized?
So they're not on 6270.
Is there
Perry
someone-
has one more.
Is someone just
amendment.
chatting, or,
Yeah,
hello? Does someone want to be recognized, or are you inadvertently unmuted? Okay, hearing no one wanting to be recognized. Are there amendments to the amendment to the amendment? Hearing none, prepare yourselves. We would move to a vote on the amendment to the amendment. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Okay, those opposed signify by saying nay.
Nay. Now, is that this amendment or is that this amendment?
What, Dina, what? I think you're out of order anyway.
Excuse
I don't know what you're saying, but, in the opinion of the chair, the nays have it. Nays have it. The amendment is not adopted. We would now move to, are there further amendments to the amendment, the nature of a substitute? Hearing none, then the question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify, prepare yourselves by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. And the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question is now on adoption, favorably reporting H.R. 5315 as amended the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay.
Nay.
Okay, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the bill is amended and is approved and ordered reported.
Mr.
favorably.
Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
Okay. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. DeFazio.
Aye.
Mr. DeFazio votes aye. Mr. Graves of Missouri.
Aye.
Mr. Graves of Missouri votes aye. Ms. Norton.
aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Crawford. Ms. Johnson of Texas.
Johnson, Texas votes aye.
Mr. Gibbs. Mr. Larson of Washington.
Aye.
Mr. Larson of Washington votes aye. Mr. Weber of Florida. Webster of Florida, my apologies. Mr. Webster of Florida votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano.
Aye.
Ms. Napolitano votes aye. Mr. Massey. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Katko.
Mr. Katko votes aye.
Mr. Katko votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Carson.
Mr. Carson votes aye.
Mr. Carson votes aye. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes aye. Ms. Titus.
Titus votes aye.
Ms. Titus votes aye. Mr. Rouser.
Aye.
Mr. Rouser votes aye. Mr. Maloney of New York. Mr. Bost. Mr. Huffman. Mr. Weber of Texas.
Weber votes aye.
Mr. Weber of Texas votes aye. Ms. Brownlee. Mr. LaMalfa. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Mr. Westerman. Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mr. Payne. Mr. Mast. Mr. Mast votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Desaulnier.
Desaulnier votes aye.
Mr. Desaulnier votes aye. Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Fitzpatrick votes aye.
Mr. Fitzpatrick votes aye. Mr. Lynch. Ms. Gonzalez Colon.
Mr. Lynch votes aye.
Mr. Lynch votes aye. Ms. Gonzalez Colon votes aye. Mr. Carvajal.
Carbajal votes aye.
Mr. Carvajal votes aye. Mr. Balderson.
Alderson votes aye.
Mr. Balderson votes aye. Mr. Brown of Maryland. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Malinowski.
Malinowski, aye.
Mr. Malinowski votes aye. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Stanton.
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes aye. Mr. Allred. Mr. Van Drew. Ms. Davids of Kansas.
Aye.
Ms. Davids of Kansas votes aye. Mr. Guest. Mr. Garcia of Illinois.
Garcia votes aye.
Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes aye. Mr. Nels.
Nels votes aye.
Mr. Nels votes aye. Mr. Delgado.
Aye.
Mr. Delgado votes aye. Ms. Mace.
No.
Ms. Mace votes no. Mr. Pappas.
Pappas votes aye.
Mr. Pappas votes aye. Ms. Maliatakis.
Aye.
Ms. Maliatakis votes aye. Mr. Lamb.
Lamb votes yes.
Mr. Lamb votes aye. Ms. Van Dyne.
No.
Ms. Van Dyne votes no. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Jimenez.
Jimenez votes aye.
Mr. Jimenez votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss.
Auchincloss, aye.
Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mrs. Steele.
Gill votes no.
Mrs. Steele votes no. Ms. Bordeaux.
Bordeaux votes aye.
Ms. Bordeaux votes aye. Mr. Kahele.
Kahele votes aye.
Mr. Kahele votes aye. Ms. Strickland.
Strickland votes aye.
Ms. Strickland votes aye. Ms. Williams of Georgia.
Williams of Georgia votes aye.
Ms. Williams of Georgia votes aye. Ms. Newman.
Newman votes aye.
Ms. Newman votes aye. Mr. Carter of Louisiana.
Carter votes aye.
Mr. Carter of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Gibbs. Mr. Gibbs votes aye. Mr. Massey. Mr. Cohen.
Aye.
Mr. Cohen
Cohen
votes
votes aye.
aye. Mr. Cirrus. Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois.
Aye.
Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois.
good.
Votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Johnson of Georgia votes aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Maloney of New York.
Mr. Maloney votes aye.
Mr. Maloney of New York votes aye. Mr. Bost. Mr. Huffman.
Huffman votes aye.
Mr. Huffman votes aye. Ms. Brownlee.
Ms. Brownlee votes aye.
Ms. Brownlee votes aye. Mr. LaMalfa. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Mr. Payne. Mr. Lowenthal. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Brown of Maryland.
Mr. Brown of Maryland votes aye.
Mr. Brown of Maryland votes aye. Mr. Stauber.
Mr. Stauber votes aye.
Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Allred.
Aye.
Mr. Allred votes aye. Mr. Van Drew. Mr. Guest. Mr. Moulton.
Ms. Wilson. Ms. Wilson of Florida votes aye.
Ms. Wilson of Florida votes aye.
Are there members who are not recorded, who wish to be recorded? Someone,
Yes.
Mr. Gallagher votes aye.
Yes. Congressman Lowenthal? I am a yes. Congressman Lowenthal.
Mr. Lowenthal votes aye.
and did you catch Congressman Gallagher? He also spoke.
What was the vote by Mr. Gallagher?
Mr. Gallagher votes aye.
Mr. Gallagher votes aye.
Is Gonzalez Colon recorded?
Who?
Ms.
Gonzalez Colon?
Ms. Gonzalez Colon is recorded as aye.
Johnson of Texas? Am I
Ms.
recorded?
Ms. Johnson of Texas is recorded as aye.
Thank you.
All right.
This is Mr. Moulton. I've been waiting to hear my name called again. I'm aye.
Mr. Moulton votes aye.
Okay, any other members? Hearing none, the clerk will report the roll.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the yeas were 54 and the nays were 10.
Okay, the amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute is adopted and ordered reported to the House. We now move on to the next bill, which is H.R. 6270, the Advanced Aviation Infrastructure Modernization Act. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Aviation is discharged from further consideration of H.R. 6270. I call up the bill for consideration. The clerk, without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. And I believe at this point that Representative Larson has an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6270 offered by Mr. Larson of Washington, number 016.
Without objection, the amendment in nature of a substitute shall be considered as read and shall be considered base text for purposes of further amendment. I now recognize Representative Larson for a statement on his amendment.
Thank you, Chair DeFazio. U.S. aviation is undergoing a historic shift with the emergence of Advanced Air Mobility, or AAM. Nearly 100 companies in my own state of Washington State and across the country are considering AAM concepts like electric vertical takeoff and landing, or eVTOL aircraft. eVTOLs could be used to help reduce traffic congestion and aviation emissions and improve mobility options, particularly in dense urban environments. To prepare for AAM aircraft, communities must begin planning now for their potential operation. This planning includes considering how new AAM technology will impact local communities and building the necessary infrastructure for these aircraft to operate. Planning must include considerations for ease of access, for equitable use, and integration into existing transportation systems. The Bipartisan Advanced Aviation Infrastructure Modernization Act, or AAIM Act, provides funding for state and local governments to develop comprehensive plans on the infrastructure necessary for the safe and efficient operation of AAM aircraft in the national airspace system. The act is supported by numerous stakeholder groups, including the National Association of Counties, Helicopter Association International, General Aviation Manufacturers Association, the National Business Aviation Association, and the Aerospace Industries Association, among others. I want to thank the Chair, Chair DeFazio, and Ranking Member Graves of Missouri for their consideration of this bill, and to thank the Aviation Subcommittee Ranking Member Garrett Graves, Representative Titus of Nevada, Representative Balderson of Ohio, and other members who sponsored this bipartisan legislation. And of course, thanks to the staff on both sides of the aisle for working hard to get this bill in shape and before the committee, and I'd ask the committee to support this legislation. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. I now recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. HR 6270 establishes a pilot program for grants related to advanced air mobility, or AAM, infrastructure planning. So the United States has a robust network of general aviation airports and heliports that touch just about every community that we represent. And as AAM vehicles approach initial operations, they're going to challenge and change how our nation's airports and our national airspace system are used. So enlisting state and local experts to help plan for the integration of AAM into our national transportation system is going to ensure that innovative AAM technology works to benefit all of our communities. Their planning efforts, which will be posted on the DOT's website, are going to provide templates for other communities to learn from and to build upon. And I want to thank Chairman Larson and Ranking Member Graves for their work on this bill and their leadership on advanced air mobility, in general. So with that, I'd urge my colleagues to support 6270, and I'd yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, gentlemen. I now recognize myself for such time as I may consume. I support HR 6270, the Advanced Aviation Infrastructure Modernization Act. I congratulate the authors of the bill, the subcommittee chair and the subcommittee ranking member. Just a couple of years ago, this was, people made fun of flying cars. They said, like the Jetsons. We're on the verge of actually having this become a daily fixture of life in the United States of America. It has tremendous potential to reduce congestion on the existing road systems and provide equity for underserved communities and provide a sustainable daily commuting option, which will save time and if most of these devices are electrified, we'll avoid the use of fossil fuels. But we got to be sure this is safe. We didn't really get ahead of the issue on spaceports. And the FAA has negligent criteria, shall I say, negligible criteria. When they proposed a spaceport right directly in the flight path to Denver International, I said, what are you thinking? How are you going to utilize that without interrupting commercial traffic? The FAA says, well, we don't have any jurisdiction to make those kinds of determinations. And that was an oversight by this committee in not giving them that authority. In this case, HR 6270 would establish a 2-year pilot program that would fund comprehensive planning grants for state, local governments to provide for the development, deployment of AAM, Advanced Air Mobility, vertiports, and related infrastructure in their communities. The pilot also provides limited funding for some public vertiport construction only after specific FAA standards are met. So we won't make the same mistake that we made and are making with the so-called spaceports. HR 6270 continues this committee's thorough oversight of the emerging AAM industry, helps local communities prepare for this new technology, and I encourage my colleagues to support the bill. Mr. Graves, Louisiana, ranking member, wishes to be recognized. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to thank Chairman Larson and Ms. Titus for working with us on this legislation. I want to thank Ranking Member Graves for his efforts on this as well. Mr. Chairman, you made a note that flying cars, and I think maybe to take it a step back, think for just a minute, many years ago, when all we had were cars or horse and buggies, and all of a sudden they said, hey, we're gonna start flying airplanes. They invented airplanes, and they're going to start incorporating that technology, that mode of transportation into the fold. Only thing is, we didn't have airports. We didn't have runways. We didn't have landing strips. And so at that point in time, they had to figure out, okay, what are we going to do? We are at a situation right now where we have entirely new modes of transportation that we're on the cusp of being able to incorporate. Entirely new modes of transportation. In the last legislation, we talked about the safety benefits. In this case, we're talking about urban air mobility, just like Just like right now, I can go on here and I can pull up a TNC, a Lyft, or an Uber. Mr. Perry, I don't think your flip phone does that, but I can pull them up and I can order it right now, and I can get a ride to wherever. Well, the deal is that we're on the cusp of being able to do the same thing with urban air mobility. I'll tell you why I think this is so important. Look, we deal with every mode of transportation in this committee. In my home state of Louisiana, we are decades and decades behind where we need to be on navigation, on flood control, on coastal restoration, on hurricane protection. We are decades behind where we need to be on building roads and bridges. We're decades behind where we need to be with water and wastewater. This is the one place where we're actually trying to stay ahead. This is a fundamentally new mode of transportation that we're trying to incorporate in. So let me tell you what that means in my home state, where I believe we have more bridge crossings per mile of road than anywhere else in the country. We're looking right now at roads and maybe the level of services as such that we've got to build a new bridge. Well, with this technology, you might be able to eliminate the need to build a bridge because you can use urban air mobility to cross over those waterways. You can use urban air mobility to reduce congestion in some of these key areas because you can fly people over certain regions. This is fundamentally new. It's fundamentally different, and we can't just all of a sudden plop this stuff in and say, oh, now we're going to do this. Let's take a minute to invest. And let me be clear what we're talking about. $12.5 million over 2 years, each year for 2 years. That's it. That once again, allowing folks to get the resources to think through this, to plan properly, including making sure that you're integrating it into your public transit, integrating it into your rail, integrating into your airplanes and automobiles. This isn't something that is a waste of money. This allows the United States to facilitate this mode of technology. And as my friend from Pennsylvania brought up earlier, the BVLOS, the Beyond Visual Line of Sight, that together with right-of-way issues and training issues and integration into airspace, some of the problems with remote ID. We are doing everything we can to stymie this technology, the incorporation of this technology into America. It's not just about the technology, it's about all of the different sensors and cameras and everything that goes along with it. We're watching Australia, we're watching European Union, we're watching countries in the Middle East that are farther ahead of us than we are in regard to laying out the planning, the regulation. This is an opportunity for the United States to maintain our leadership role in aviation and new technology. And this is a small investment for a short period of time to ensure that we properly integrate this into our different modes of transportation. This is an effort for us to ensure that we are the leaders in aviation and that we do not impede but rather facilitate this technology, which I do believe is going to result in cost savings and reduction in other modes of transportation. I urge adoption of the legislation and yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Representative Titus from Nevada is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too support the AAIM Act, which will bolster the emerging advanced air mobility field with the development of vertiports, electric charging and fueling stations, and connectivity to public transportation and multimodal hubs. This evolving mode of transportation is more climate friendly, it reduces congestion, and it has the potential to significantly influence economic activity in the near future. Estimates show that the AAIM sector could create some 300,000 jobs and generate $115 billion by the year of 2035. As many organizations are exploring this vertical takeoff vehicle concepts, the grants provided through this bill will assist cities like Las Vegas, which have already begun laying the groundwork for future AAIM infrastructure and operations. I want to thank the chair, Mr. Larson, and Ranking Member Graves for leading this effort. And I encourage my colleagues, especially those old enough to remember the Jetsons, to vote in favor of the bill.
I thank the
I yield
gentleman.
back.
Do others wish to be heard on the amendment to the amendment? Okay, hearing none, we'll move on to amendments to the amendment to the amendment. The clerk will designate the first amendment. I believe it's Perry 596.
Amendment number 1 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 6270, offered by Mr. Perry, number 596.
Okay, without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to speak in favor of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment strikes the environmental impacts of transportation from the selection criteria for advanced air mobility planning grants under this bill. To be clear, the utopian AAM system envisioned by some is still far, far from being realized, assuming it is ever realized. Given the gap between where the industry stands today and where it needs to be, it seems unwise and borderline reckless to be spending any money on planning grants to further this uncertain utopian future. That being said, if we're going to provide planning grants, they should at least be used to promote actual innovative technological advances that promote improvements in transportation of goods and people. This should be the goal. If there are secondary environmental benefits from said improvements, so be it. But we must not delude ourselves into a dystopian future by prioritizing environmentalism over actual working infrastructure. You got to have your priorities straight, ladies and gentlemen. In other words, we must prevent AAM push from being a repeat of the other misguided policies pushed by this administration to replace things that work, things that actually work today, with allegedly green things that do not work. I just asked adoption of this amendment, and I yield the balance, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, do others wish to be heard on
Mr.
the?
Chair.
I recognize the gentleman from Washington for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First off, I want to let folks know I totally oppose Representative Graves' egregious and uncalled for attack on Mr. Perry's flip phone. And I expect an apology on behalf of Mr. Perry. Second, I want everyone to vote against his amendment. But the point I want to make is that this isn't utopian. The FAA is in the process of working through certification for several AAM vehicles. And we need to be sure that the planning for the integration of these AAM vehicles into the airspace is happening now. When we get to the FAA reauthorization bill at the end of next year, we're going to have another and longer conversation about what are the next steps for AAM integration. But we need to start planning now for that, which is the purpose of the entire bill. This amendment focuses on one of several criteria. In fact, there are 6 or more issues that the FAA would use in order to make determinations about grant requests. Only one of them is reducing surface congestion and the environmental impacts of transportation. AAM is about a lot of things. It includes being about reducing surface congestion and the existing environmental impacts of existing transportation. That is one of its selling points. That is going to be one of the selling points of all the companies that are getting into this business, and it makes sense to include this criteria into the bill. So again, it's not utopian. It's coming at us very quickly, and we need to catch up with what's happening. Second, it is one of the selling value propositions that the AAM companies bring to the debate in terms of reducing environmental impacts of transportation. So I just would ask folks to oppose this amendment, and so we can move on with this bill and do our part to prepare for the reality, which is likely 2 years, if not less, away from us. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. Do others wish to be heard on Mr. Graves, Louisiana is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, just very quickly, I want to make note, as my friend Mr. Larson did, that Mr. Perry does have a flip phone. No, seriously, I want to make note that this issue, what this amendment does is it tries to strike a provision in the legislation that says environmental impacts of transportation. This is one of many factors, and I want to read what the bill says. In awarding grants under this subsection, the Secretary, quote, shall consider, and it talks about geographic diversity, it talks about comprehensive plans, then Under the subsection of comprehensive plans, it goes through and it lists out 6 things, which includes integration of AAM operations into the national airspace system, improving transportation safety, connectivity, access, a balance between rural and urban areas, leveraging existing transportation, intermodal and multimodal facilities. It talks about reducing surface congestion and the environmental impacts of transportation. It goes on. It talks about growing the economy and creating jobs in the United States, encouraging community engagement when planning for AAM for related infrastructure. So this is one of many, many factors. It is not dominant. It is in no way prioritized over the other. It is a single factor that, that they're asking being taken into consideration. In regard to comment about this being utopian, look, this stuff's happening right now. This is you can use the Google. I'll let you use my advanced technology here and on the interwebs, and you can look it up there. Okay, you can use DuckDuckGo. How about that one? But this stuff is happening now. This is an opportunity for us to not seed, and in this case, when I say seed, C-E-D-E, seed this technology or this opportunity to other countries. This is something the United States should maintain our leadership in. So I urge rejection of this amendment, yield back.
Okay, do others wish to be heard on the amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute? Hearing none, we'll move then to a vote on the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Prepare yourselves. Those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed will signify by saying nay. Nay.
Nay.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it. The amendment is not agreed to. We would now move on to amendment. The clerk will designate the amendment. I believe it's Perry 597.
Amendment number 2 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 6270, offered by
Mr. Perry.
Mr. Perry, number 597.
Okay. Without objection, the amendment is to the amendment in the nature of a substitute is considered as read, and I recognize the author of the amendment, Mr. Perry, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment eliminates transit agencies as eligible entities for the Advanced Air Mobility Planning grants under this bill. It strikes me odd that the transit agencies were included as eligible entities for these planning grants and calls into question whether this is just yet another means by which transit agencies can bilk the taxpayers without providing any tangible improvement. As previously stated, these planning grants seem incredibly premature relative to the state of the industry. And while I appreciate my good friend from Louisiana's view to the future, I just remind everybody here, we can't even fly UAVs that have been flying around in war zones and across the country beyond the line of sight, but yet somehow this is happening. Anyhow, if somehow AAM advances and becomes the next wave of technological advantage and advancement, which is a big if, transit agencies should be the very last entities to be anywhere near such a system. Despite receiving $1.5 trillion in inflation-adjusted taxpayer funding since the late 1960s and a $69 billion COVID relief funding, transit agencies still have at least $100 billion in maintenance backlog, which wasn't a great testimonial to their management of their fiscal resources. This backlog means transit agencies are failing to maintain and ensure the safety of their systems. Just last month, the MTA shooting provided horrific real-time evidence of this as the largest transit agency in the nation failed to upkeep its security cameras. Like, I understand tracks are expensive and cars are expensive and all that stuff, but security cameras allowed the suspect to remain at large for a significant amount of time, and I think it shocked the world. This failure to maintain systems endangers riders and undermines the traveling public's willingness to ride public transportation, which, by the way, ridership continues to decline. Adding further responsibilities to these transit agencies when they're unable to meet the basic current requirements of their current systems is simply a recipe for disaster. Even worse, the concept of transit agencies operating flying machinery greatly increases the risk and cost if their maintenance backlog procedures precludes them, from being able to maintain and upkeep their current equipment requirements. If you actually want to save lives in the future and end this boondoggle, please support this amendment, Mr. Chairman, and I yield the balance.
Thank you, gentlemen. Do others wish to be heard on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman?
Recognize the gentleman from Washington State, Chairman of the subcommittee. Mr. Larson, 5 minutes.
Thank you. First off, I take back what I said about Mr. Perry's flip phone. Second, I'd ask folks to oppose this amendment. I understand there are folks on the committee and in Congress who don't support transit, and you can continue to not support transit, and you can be against this amendment. The underlying purpose of the bill is to support the initial planning into how local governments can incorporate AAM into transportation planning. In any one jurisdiction, it might be appropriate for a transit agency to be lead on planning. It might be the airport. It might be the Metropolitan Planning Organization. It might be the city government, the county government. That's why we've laid these out. We can't really define which of the entities would be the most appropriate in any given region or area of the country. So it does not make sense to exclude transit agencies from the potential of getting planning grants. As well, I would also note, just near the end of Mr. Perry's comments, he alluded to or implied that transit agencies would be operating these, I think he used the term flying machines. This bill in no way allows them to do that. The operators of AAM are largely, not only right now, private companies. I don't see that changing at all. This is a planning grant bill so that we can prepare for the reality of what is going to be happening in our skies over the next couple of years. And just know that when we get to the FAA reauthorization bill at the end of next year, members should be prepared to be thinking about what the next steps are so that we can keep up with the integration of these vehicles into the airspace. So I'd ask folks to oppose Mr. Perry's amendment. Yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Do any others wish to be heard? Okay, hearing none. Then I would oppose the amendment, and we'll now move to a vote on the amendment, the nature of a substitute by Mr. Perry. Those in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed will signify by saying nay.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it. The nays have it. The amendment is not adopted. We would now move to the next amendment. I believe it's Mr. Perry 590. Clerk will designate.
Amendment number 3 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 6270, offered by Mr. Perry, number 590.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on behalf of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Here we go again, picking winners and losers. Putting aside the fact that this bill appears to put the cart before the horse when it comes to actual feasibility of these advanced air mobility projects, it is unacceptable that we're conceding the electrification of AAM aircraft through these planning grants. AAM optimists may say that electric charging is necessary for these aircraft, or perhaps that electrification is the direction that is nascent in industry, that the nascent industry is headed. If that's the case, why are we paying for even the planning of these projects, if that's the case? If this space-age reality envisioned by Green New Deal proponents in both parties comes to fruition, we'll have electric cars on our roads and electric AAM soaring through our cities and skies. The CCP would love this new world, since it would be a boon for their exploitive rare earth mines and the slave labor factories in which AAM parts could be manufactured and likely will be manufactured. In addition, we've likely all seen the fire sparked or fueled by lithium-ion batteries ranging from consumer electronics to scooters and cars. These fires are challenging enough for firefighters to address on the ground or at sea. let alone in the air. Having electric aircraft dodging skyscrapers to deliver cargo or give tours is a recipe for disaster. This amendment strikes electric charging from the list of eligible plan consideration, and I urge adoption of the amendment, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. Do others wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Larson, Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd ask folks to oppose this amendment. If you consider the language on page 2 and even into page 3 where it talks about what the comprehensive plan, that is what the DOT would expect from a comprehensive plan, it goes through a variety of criteria. They want to know the identification of a planned or potential public use or private use vertiport locations, description of the infrastructure necessary to support Aaim operations. Section 4 is the identification of physical and digital infrastructure required to meet the standards for vertiport design. It goes on. But then it just lists a variety of things that need to be considered, including the modifications to existing infrastructure and ground sensors, electric charging, other fueling requirements, electric utility requirements, wireless, cybersecurity requirements, and so on. It's just the electric charging piece that Representative Perry points out. Again, it's just one element of many elements that need to be considered in comprehensive planning for the eventual construction of vertiports. And the truth is, most of these, in the private sector, most of the proposals that are emerging for eVTOL are electric. They are electric vehicle takeoff and landing vehicles. That's the E of eVTOL. Some of them are VTOL, that is non-electric. Most of them have, the plan is already, and the development of the current ones that you see flying in the air, as Representative Graves from Louisiana pointed out, are electric. So again, it makes zero sense to focus in on this one element of what would be required in a comprehensive plan. This actually is supportive of what the private sector is wanting to do and how they want to build, how they want to develop these vehicles. So again, folks can be against electric charging. This is not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is in planning for advanced air mobility in the future, the industry itself has already chosen how they're going to introduce themselves in the airspace, and that's with electric. It makes perfect sense to include in comprehensive plans how the planning entities are going to consider electric charging in their plans, along with many other elements. So I'd ask folks to oppose this amendment. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Do others, Mr. Graves, Louisiana is recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to highlight what my friend from Washington just said. This is simply, what this does is it talks about the planning criteria, and it says it may include things like electric charging, but it also says other fueling requirements. So that could mean gasoline. It could mean AV fuel or whatever. And so this is not one of those scenarios that I share my friend from Pennsylvania's concerns with, where you have Congress coming in and trying to dictate technology and trying to mandate that everything go electric. I've actually joined a gentleman from Pennsylvania in opposing the funding of EV charging stations in the infrastructure bill and other places. I think it is wrong for Congress to step in and mandate technology to pretend as though we're the best arbiters of what technology should succeed and fail. In this case, it is an exhaustive list that includes everything. Now look, I've got a couple of electric motorbikes, and the difference between electric and internal combustion engines is with electric, you can achieve peak power like that. You can achieve peak power like that. So why do we have runways and everything, the long runways on airplanes? Because you've got to ultimately get the compression in the engines up to the ultimate pressure and speed that you need to get the right. But speed is based on the compression, which based on the speed of the propellers turning or the jet engines. In this case, with eVTOL, using, in some cases for short ride, using an electric engine is going to probably be the best thing, or to be what makes the most sense. But let me say it again. This legislation in the planning section, it's permissive. It allows you to use an internal combustion engine, it allows you to continue using gas or whatever. It explicitly says fueling requirements. But in some cases, particularly for short runs, it's going to make sense for the innovators to use electric engines. Right now, airports have AV fuel. We don't have electric planes flying around, so this would be a fundamental change. Or if you're talking about vertiports in urban areas or in rural areas, you're not going to have the electricity that's required for charging these types of electric aircraft. And so the gentleman from Pennsylvania has some good amendments. This isn't one of them. I'd urge rejection of this amendment and yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Others wish to be heard on the amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute? Hearing none, I would oppose the amendment. We'll then move to a vote on the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Those in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed will signify by saying nay.
Nay.
No.
Nay.
Nay.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it. The amendment's not agreed to. The clerk will designate the next amendment.
Amendment number 4 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 6270, offered by Mr. Perry, number 591.
Without objection, the amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute is considered as read, and the gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment creates a non-federal share requirement of a minimum of 50%. According to some industry optimists, advanced air mobility systems would turn U.S. cities into a Jetson-style landscape with innovative aircraft delivering cargo and transporting passengers. If you subscribe to this vision for the future, it may make perfect sense for the federal government to fund planning for additional provincial infrastructure systems for this new mode of transportation. However, while some AAMs have had their first flights, many projects are far, far from truly getting off the ground. Furthermore, the technical challenges associated with these proposed aircraft are substantial, with the FAA describing AAMs as highly automated. Just remind everybody, we're just getting the hang of autonomous consumer automobiles, a technology we've had for over a century. Since industry leaders are still working out the overall feasibility of these vehicles, it only makes sense for municipalities planning for them to foot at least some portion of project costs. And I urge colleagues to support this amendment in the interest of fiscal sanity. Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance.
I thank gentlemen. Does anyone wish to be heard on?
Mr. Chair.
Recognize the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Larson.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, just if I could just clarify, the amendment I have before me says not less than 20%. I heard Mr. Perry say 50%.
I've got 50 on my sheet, so I'm not sure where the disconnect is.
Can we stop the clock and figure out what we're talking about here? Mr. Chair. It may not have changed my argument, but I just want to know we know what we're voting on.
Well, the summary said 20. Do we have the text available? What's that?
The text of the amendment that I have says 20%.
Okay, well, for line 23, as written, it says 20%, but if the gentleman wishes to ask unanimous consent to change that to 50%.
So if I could, the amendment as submitted was changed. It is 20%. I apologize for my.
Okay.
All right. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
All right,
Thank
the
you.
gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. Yeah, I asked that only for clarification because we want to be sure we're voting on the right things around here, and I do oppose the amendment. This bill is for planning grants only. It's not for construction. It is for planning grants only. We will be addressing, and I'll say this, we ought to be addressing potential construction as part of the debate discussions we have in the FAA reauthorization bill in 2023. We do need to be thinking ahead about that. And at that time is a perfectly good time to be thinking about the federal cost share. But we need to get this planning started. And we need to encourage potential urban, suburban, and rural areas to consider how they might be able to participate in supporting this new emerging aviation technology, especially for those smaller airports that want to consider becoming as well vertiports. And I can think of several in my district that otherwise that are really great locations for vertiports, but would not have the dollars needed to put the planning in place to be thinking about in the future constructing those vertiports. So I just think right now for this planning grant, for this 2-year planning grant, that we should not have the non-federal cost share in it, have folks be eligible for 100% if it's going to be possible for them to do that. And again, to remind folks, this bill is just one of the building blocks that we have to put in place to support the future of this emerging technology. We're going to have a more robust discussion in the FAA reauthorization bill. Let me say this. We should have a more robust discussion in the FAA reauthorization bill as the economy, this industry continues to change, evolve, and grow over the next 12 months. But I think right now we need to encourage these entities to think about where they're going to be in the world of vertiport planning, and we need to not create a barrier for them to do that so that we can get the best system overall in the future. So with that, I would just ask folks to reject this amendment and yield back. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Others wish to be recognized? Okay, hearing none. I would oppose the amendment and would move to a vote on the amendment. Those in favor of the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute will signify by saying aye. Those opposed will signify by saying nay.
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 In the opinion of the chair. In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there additional amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Okay, hearing none. We will then be moved to the question on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Pretty quiet out there, okay?
Aye.
All right, thank you.
Aye, aye,
All right, okay.
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, all right, that's good. Those opposed will signify by saying nay. Okay, in the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. In the amendment in the nature of substitute is agreed to. The question is now on the adoption favorably reporting of H.R. 6270 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
Reported vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. DeFazio.
Aye.
Mr. DeFazio votes aye. Mr. Graves of Missouri. Mr. Graves of Missouri votes aye. Ms. Norton. Mr. Crawford.
Crawford, aye.
Mr. Crawford votes aye. Ms. Johnson of Texas. Mr. Gibbs. Mr. Larson of Washington.
Aye.
Mr. Larson of Washington votes aye. Mr. Webster of Florida. Mr. Webster of Florida votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano.
Aye.
Mrs. Napolitano votes aye. Mr. Massey. Mr. Cohen.
Aye.
Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Cirrus. Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois. Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Katko.
Katko votes aye.
Mr. Katko votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Yes, aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Carson.
Aye.
Mr. Carson votes aye. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes aye. Ms. Titus.
Titus votes aye.
Ms. Titus votes aye. Mr. Rouser.
Aye.
Mr. Rouser votes aye. Mr. Maloney of New York.
I didn't ask him.
Mr. Maloney of New York. Mr. Bost.
Aye.
Mr. Bost votes aye. Mr. Huffman.
Huffman votes aye.
Mr. Huffman votes aye. Mr. Weber of Texas.
Weber votes aye.
Mr. Weber of Texas votes aye. Ms. Brownlee. Mr. LaMalfa. Ms. Wilson of Florida.
Aye. LaMalfa, aye.
Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Ms. Wilson of Florida.
Ms. Wilson of Florida votes aye.
Ms. Wilson of Florida votes aye. Mr. Westerman. Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mr. Payne.
Aye.
Mr. Payne votes aye. Mr. Mast. Mr. Mast votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal.
Lowenthal votes aye.
Mr. Lowenthal votes aye. Mr. Gallagher.
Mr. Gallagher votes aye.
Mr. Gallagher votes aye. Mr. Desaulnier.
Desaulnier votes aye.
Mr. Desaulnier votes aye. Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Fitzpatrick votes aye.
Mr. Fitzpatrick votes aye. Mr. Lynch.
Mr. Lynch votes aye.
Mr. Lynch votes aye. Ms. Gonzalez Colon.
Just in case. You want to sit down?
Mr. Carbajal.
Mr. Carbajal votes aye.
Mr. Carbajal votes aye. Mr. Balderson.
Alderson votes aye.
Mr. Balderson votes aye. Mr. Brown of Maryland.
Mr. Brown of Maryland votes aye.
Mr. Brown of Maryland votes aye. Mr. Stauber.
Mr. Stauber votes aye.
Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mr. Malinowski.
I will tell you, doctor, you have a better hole in the pole. That's a three.
Mr. Burchett.
Somebody's talking in the background, please mute.
Mr. Stanton.
Stanton votes aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota.
Johnson votes aye.
Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes aye. Mr. Allred. Mr. Van Drew.
Mr. Van Drew votes aye.
Mr. Van Drew votes aye. Ms. Davids of Kansas.
David votes aye.
Ms. Davids of Kansas votes aye. Mr. Guest. Mr. Garcia of Illinois.
Garcia votes aye.
Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes aye. Mr. Nels.
Nels aye.
Mr. Nels votes aye. Mr. Delgado. Ms. Mace.
Mace, aye.
Ms. Mace votes aye. Mr. Pappas. Ms. Maliatakis. Mr. Lamb.
Lamb votes yes.
Mr. Lamb votes aye. Ms. Van Dyne.
Hey, take one shot behind me while I'm in committee.
Ms. Van Dyne votes aye. Mr. Moulton.
Moulton, aye.
Mr. Moulton votes aye. Mr. Jimenez. Mr. Auchincloss.
votes aye.
I'm sorry, was that Mr. Jimenez?
Yes, votes aye.
Mr. Jimenez votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss.
Auchincloss.
Could the gentleman repeat, please?
Auchincloss, aye.
Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mrs. Steele. Ms. Bordeaux.
Steele votes aye. Steele votes aye.
Mrs. Steele votes aye. Ms. Bordeaux.
Bordeaux votes aye.
Ms. Bordeaux votes aye. Mr. Kahele.
Kahele votes aye.
Mr. Kahele votes aye. Ms. Strickland.
Strickland votes aye.
Ms. Strickland votes aye. Ms. Williams of Georgia.
Williams of Georgia votes aye.
Ms. Williams of Georgia votes aye. Ms. Newman.
Newman votes aye.
Ms. Newman votes aye. Mr. Carter of Louisiana.
Carter votes aye.
Mr. Carter of Louisiana votes aye. Ms. Norton. Ms. Johnson.
Ms. Norton votes aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Ms. Johnson of Texas.
Johnson of Texas votes aye.
Ms. Johnson of Texas votes aye. Mr. Gibbs. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Cirrus. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Maloney of New York. Ms. Brownlee.
Ms. Brownlee votes aye.
Ms. Brownlee votes aye. Ms. Gonzalez Colon. Mr. Malinowski. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Allred. Mr. Guest.
Hold on. This is Mr. Allred. I'm sorry. I vote aye.
Mr. Allred votes aye. Mr. Guest. Mr. Delgado. Mr. Pappas. Ms. Maliatakis.
Are there other members who are not recorded, who wish to be recorded? Hearing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 55 yeas and 2 nays.
Okay, the amendment in nature of a substitute is adopted and ordered reported to the House. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 3482, the National Center for the Advancement of Aviation Act. Without objection, Subcommittee on Aviation is discharged from further consideration of H.R. 3482. I call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered read and open for amendment at any point. I understand that Representative Carson has an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3482, offered by Mr. Carson, number 017.
Without objection, the amendment to the amendment in nature of a substitute shall be, without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read and shall be considered base text for purposes of further amendment. I now recognize Rep. Carson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for your leadership. Today is bittersweet. I'm glad that my bill is finally being marked up after working on this for over 2 sessions. Unfortunately, my partner on this bill is not here to join me, Representative Don Young of Alaska, former chairman of our committee. You know, his work and support was invaluable in helping us get to today's markup. This National Center for the Advancement of Aviation Act is both bipartisan and bicameral. I'm very pleased that so many members of our committee are sponsors of the bill, including Aviation Chair Larson. Our committee has worked for years to make America's skies the safest in the world and to strengthen the industry workforce to maintain the highest standards of aviation excellence. This bill supports and promotes the collaboration among civil, commercial, and military aviation sectors to address the demands and challenges associated with ensuring a safe and vibrant national aviation system through research, education, and training. Too often in the past, innovation and lessons learned in various aviation sectors have not been shared in a collaborative or timely manner, especially considering rapid developments in new technology. This bill helps break down those silos across commercial aviation, general aviation, and military aviation sectors. This will not only improve safety and best practices, but it will also expand opportunities for those interested in a more diverse aviation workforce, for the young and not so young, from those just starting out to those with experience who want to move into other types of aviation work. The National Center will focus on 4 key areas with an emphasis on aviation workforce development. First, it would support education efforts and provide resources to curriculum developers so educators at all levels have the tools and training they need to educate the next generation of aviation professionals. Secondly, the National Center will provide a forum to leverage and share expertise amongst industry sectors, including the dissemination of existing high school education curriculum to develop and deploy a workforce of pilots, aerospace engineers, and unmanned aircraft system operators, aviation maintenance technicians, and so much more. Third, it will serve as a central repository for economic and safety data research and analysis, allowing for a comprehensive perspective on industry information. And finally, it will support symposiums and conferences to facilitate collaboration across the industry. Regarding the amendment and the nature of a substitute, I thank our chairman for working with me on some important technical corrections to improve transparency and good governance provisions. This bill is funded by the users of our aviation systems and not general taxpayer funds. That's critically important. This reinvestment into growing in a competitive aviation workforce represents less than 0.03% of all revenues going into the Aviation Trust Fund each year. I want to thank the chairman again. And to close, the aviation and aerospace industry supports over 11 million jobs and contributes more than 1.6 trillion per year to the national economy. We have over 200 organizations, including schools, airports, airlines, unions, manufacturers, and other folks involved in aviation and aerospace. They've expressed strong support for this bill. And, I want to urge my colleagues to support the National Center for the Advancement of Aviation Act, and I yield back, Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I now recognize the ranking member, Representative Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for working with us on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. This bill creates the National Center for the Advancement of Aviation, which is a private, nonprofit organization dedicated to bringing government and aviation stakeholders together to address aviation workforce issues. In the U.S., aviation supports 11.3 million direct jobs and facilitates more than 5% of the gross domestic product, which translates into more than $1 trillion in economic activity. But like so many industries, aviation is suffering from an acute and chronic shortage of workers across many different positions, including pilots and mechanics. Without action, self-help measures by the aviation industry are simply not going to be enough to ensure the continued advancement of the aerospace industry. The National Center for the Advancement of Aviation Act is part of the answer to addressing this workforce crisis. By bringing everyone to the table, the NCAA is going to work to guide young people and assist veterans to transition to aviation careers that provide stable and gainful employment. This bipartisan legislation has widespread support in the aviation industry, and I want to acknowledge that this bill was passionately supported, as was pointed out by the late Dean of the House, Representative Don Young. While I believe that more must be done by Congress to address aviation workforce shortages, this bill is a very good first step. And I'd urge my colleagues to support it and yield back the balance.
I thank the gentleman. I yield myself to time to make it soon. As the ranking member noted, we do, and as the author noted, we do have a severe shortage and a growing cliff with retirements for the aviation workforce. At this point, women are woefully underrepresented, 2.4% of mechanics, 7% of commercial pilots. These are great jobs, and we need to diversify, expand the workforce, and HR 3482 will help address these workforce challenges by creating a national center to help fund scholarships, apprenticeships, aviation curriculum development, and other outreach to create new opportunities for students. And as I mentioned, including those from underrepresented backgrounds to pursue careers in aviation and aerospace. The center would also serve as a research repository for universities and other institutions, provide a forum to support collaboration on aviation workforce issues between government and non-governmental organizations. HR 3482 has over 462 bipartisan co-sponsors and the endorsement of nearly 200 industry and labor organizations representing every corner of the U.S. aviation aerospace industry. I urge my colleagues to support the bill. And now I recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Garrett Graves, is recognized if he wants to be recognized.
Actually, Mr. Chairman, I'll just quickly make note that the objective of this legislation is to address the shortage of aviation workers. We are seeing a surge in the need of workers as a result of the proliferation of commercial airspace, commercial travel, the resumption of travel following the COVID pandemic. We're seeing new aviation technology, and we are not seeing the corresponding workforce that goes along with it. And so I do support the objectives of this legislation. I appreciate Mr. Carson, and I know a number of members of this committee have co-sponsored this bill. I appreciate them working to help to address the need of the aviation workforce, because you can look at all the numbers, we are expected to go off a cliff here in regard to the demand of the workforce and the number of folks that are available. And so, again, I certainly do support the objectives of this legislation, and yield back.
Gentlemen, do others wish to be recognized? Hearing none, I just recognize that Don, but unfortunately, he can't speak in favor of this, but it's yet another great legacy that he has left to the United States and his home state of Alaska. With that, we will, with no other members wish to be recognized, we'll move to amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. And the clerk will designate the First Amendment.
Amendment number 1 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 3482, offered by Mr. Perry, number 592.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. Mr. Perry is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment strikes the terminology perpetual existence clause and sunsets the center 15 years after the date of enactment. That, Mr. Chairman, I urge adoption. I yield.
Thank the gentleman. Do other members wish to speak on the amendment to the amendment in nature of substitute? Mr. Graves, Louisiana is recognized. 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I apologize, but I actually I do agree with Mr. Perry on this one. I think that this underlying legislation, it does go on in perpetuity. I know we could argue that the charter's in perpetuity. I am hopeful that we're not at a point to where we need to forever help fund training in this case for aviation. I think that the mandatory spending component of this makes his amendment a little bit better and more important. I know that might not be what some of y'all expected to hear, but even a blind squirrel occasionally finds a nut, and with a flip phone. No, seriously, I do think that we ought to be a little bit more thoughtful about how this legislation be put in place. I think that right now there is no question that we have an immediate need to train and prepare for the aviation workforce demands of the future, but I think it's very difficult for us to anticipate that this is going to be needed in perpetuity, and I actually do support Mr. Perry's amendment. Yield back.
Okay. Do other members wish to be recognized on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to be recognized, sir.
Representative Carson's recognized. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to speak out against the amendment. This amendment would mandate a sunset against a new program. I don't think he has an idea of how effective or successful this new program will be, yet the gentleman wants to arbitrarily end the program after 15 years. I strongly oppose this amendment and urge my colleagues to vote no on the Perry amendment. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Others wish to be heard? If not, recognize myself. I would also rise in opposition to the amendment. This amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Representative Carson and the former member of the committee, Don Young, includes very robust transparency requirements. There'll be an annual report from the Board of Directors as well as an annual audit from the DOT Inspector General that'll better inform Congress as to whether we need to address a sunset in a future FAA reauthorization bill. As the chair of the Aviation Subcommittee, we've already begun, this committee has already begun work to prepare for the FAA reauthorization next year. I won't be here, but many of you will, and that would provide an opportunity at an appropriate time to more fully engage on this issue. So I would oppose the amendment, urge my colleagues to do the same. Do others wish to be recognized? Okay, hearing none, we will move to, are there amendments to the amendment? Hearing none, we will move to a vote on the amendment. Prepare yourselves. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Okay, all those opposed, prepare yourselves.
Nay.
Wait, I didn't call it yet. Okay, I said prepare yourself. All those opposed will signify by saying nay.
No.
Nay.
Nay.
In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it. The nays have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The clerk will report the next amendment.
Amendment number 2 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 3482 offered by Mr. Perry, number 599.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the author, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not going to talk too long here about this one either, but it just seems interesting and obvious to me that the private sector has done a pretty good job of advancing aviation since the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk. But that aside, the funding for the center would annually transfer amounts from the Airport and Airway Trust Fund. To me, those folks are the ones that need that the most. And while I understand that hard works that folks have done to advance aviation and the aviation education, I don't think giving awards to those folks should come at the expense of depleting the AATF, which funds the FAA accounts for expenditures, including facilities and research and development. If the private sector wants to do it, I think that's great, but I don't think it should come from those, from the trust fund, and so that's what this amendment does, and I would urge adoption. I yield the balance.
Thank you, gentlemen. Are there any other members who wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman.
Recognize Mr. Graves, Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Once again, Mr. Chairman, I think that Mr. Perry in this case is an amendment that makes sense. The Airport and Airway Trust Fund was set up 30 years ago, and excuse me, 50 years ago, and it was designed to fund construction projects. This legislation does effectively pull the interest off of the trust fund on an annual basis and puts it toward this training program. Let me say again, I support the objectives of the legislation that Mr. Carson and our great friend, the departed Mr. Young, have negotiated here. But to suggest that right now that we should in perpetuity fund or allow for the interest to go toward this training program in perpetuity, whenever right now I believe it's estimated to be around $8 million a year. In the future, we don't have any idea how much that's going to be. We don't know what the needs are going to be, and I have a hard time believing that any of us can justify right now saying that this is the most important thing that we need to be doing as a federal government, as opposed to letting it compete in the appropriations process with other needs in the federal government, things that are our obligation. So I do appreciate Mr. Perry highlighting this issue. I support his amendment. Yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Do others wish to be heard on the amendment? Okay, hearing none, recognize myself. The gentleman's amendment would eliminate federal funding for the new institution created by the legislation, which would obviously substantially undermine the bill's objectives. This also would not create any new deficit spending. It would have a funding source. One of the most critical elements here would be the potential to create scholarships. It costs about $200,000 to get a commercial license these days. We have veterans who are in the program at my community college in Lane County, and others who wish to become pilots or wish to become mechanics. I don't know what the cost would be to train through apprenticeship and everything, a mechanic, but I do know that number on commercial pilots. It won't jeopardize any other programs or initiatives that are funded by the Airport and Airway Trust Fund. For instance, funding for the center may be waived by the Secretary during government shutdowns or any other times when the trust fund sees a reduction or potential deficit in funding for other critical infrastructure that relate to the aviation industry. So I think the protections are there for the future should there be unanticipated drops in revenues, another pandemic, another 9/11, whatever, another 2008 crash, all the things that have in the past caused fewer people to fly and to provide less funding for the Airport and Airway Trust Fund. So with that, I would oppose the amendment. Are there others who wish to be heard? Okay, hearing none, prepare yourselves. Those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Okay, those opposed will signify by saying nay.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it. Nays have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there other amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Hearing none, then the question is on the amendment. In the nature of a substitute, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of substitute is agreed to. The question is now on the adoption favorable reporting of HR 3482 as amended, the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes, in the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is amended and approved and ordered, reported favorably to the House.
Mr. Chairman, parliamentary inquiry.
Yep.
I believe on HR 5313, the vote was reported as 54 to 10. I just wanted to ask the clerk to please clarify the outcome of that vote.
There was a correction on that vote. It was actually 54 yeas to 4 noes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, I thank the gentleman for observing that, and the record is corrected. With that, I'm going to yield the chair to the gentlelady who chairs the subcommittee, subject to the next two bills. I have an appointment with the Secretary of Commerce.
HR 7242, Community Disaster Resilience Zone Act of 2022. This is our next item for consideration. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management is discharged from further consideration of HR 7242, and I call the bill up for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 7242 offered by Mrs. Titus.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read and shall be considered base text for purposes of further amendment. I now recognize myself for a statement. Introduced by Congresswoman Sharice Davids and Congressman Garrett Graves, H.R. 7242, the Community Disaster Resilience Act of 2022, will enable FEMA to identify the communities most in need of mitigation projects and help those communities access federal funding and support to complete those projects. Climate change and development in high-risk zones have created a never-ending stream of disaster impacts that continue to cause billions of dollars in damages around the country that taxpayer dollars have to cover. This legislation will help reduce that financial burden by targeting mitigation investments to communities that are the least able to invest in resilience efforts on their own and are expected to incur the greatest amount of damage from disasters. By directing FEMA to publicly designate the most in need and at-risk census tracts as community disaster resilience zones, public and private sector stakeholders will be able to effectively target mitigation investments to those communities and in turn make them more resilient. This legislation will also help FEMA work towards its goal of achieving equity in all its programs by authorizing federal cost share flexibility for building resilience and infrastructure and community grant projects applicants in designated community disaster resilience zones. That's a mouthful. I support this legislation and would ask my colleagues to do the same. I now recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This bill's intent is to make the public more aware of the inherent risks of disasters that may affect our communities. It requires the president to maintain a natural disaster hazard assessment program where the public can determine just how vulnerable an area is for various types of natural disaster damage. Ultimately, this bill can improve pre-disaster mitigation efforts across the country, and I want to thank the chair for working with us on the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and I would urge passage of this bill as amended and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. I now recognize Subcommittee Ranking Member Webster for a statement.
Thank you, Chair. This bill, the Community Disaster Resilience Zones Act of 2022, amends the Stafford Act to include a section of natural disaster risk assessment. This section mandates the President or FEMA maintain a publicly available risk assessment program that shows that what hazards pose the most threat to the communities. It also directs the President or FEMA to provide financial or technical assistance to the communities in designated community disaster resilient zones. Establishing these zones will help communities, states, and the private sector better plan investment in mitigation. I urge support and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. Do any other members wish to be recognized for statements? Mr. Graves, be recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, this legislation is something that the Community Disaster Resilience Zone Acts of 2022. Let me first start by saying that I appreciate the opportunity to work with Congressman Davids on this bill. As noted by previous speakers, it designates the 50 most vulnerable tracts in the census tracts in the United States and tries to focus resilience dollars on those areas. Looking in this committee right now, Our subcommittee ranking member represents the state of Florida. We have Mr. Rouser here from North Carolina, Mr. Mast here from Florida. I'm from Louisiana. All of our states have unfortunately been subjected to multiple disasters. And it's not just the disasters, it's a few things. Number one, it's the fact that the people that we represent have been continually and repetitively pounded by disasters such as hurricanes, floods, in some cases, perhaps members here, I see Mr. Larson, forest fires and other challenges. From a fiscal perspective, we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars, I believe, every year at this point, reacting to these disasters. It is simply unaffordable for us to continue to do this. We have talked in this committee for years now how proactive mitigation investments ultimately save dollars. That's the fiscally conservative thing to do. But let me bring it back to a personal level. To those people that we represent that have been flooded over and over and over again, those people whose homes have been threatened or burned down, those folks that live in tornado-prone areas or that risk health and life threats as a result of winter storms. This is about what's doing right from a fiscal perspective and doing what's right from with the limited taxpayer dollars we're responsible for overseeing. But it's the right thing to do for those communities that have been repeatedly impacted and have their communities devastated by natural disasters. That's what this legislation really works to address. So I want to thank Congresswoman Davids for working with us on this. This bill is a data-driven effort to identify those communities that are most vulnerable to ensure that the dollars that we're spending go to mitigate those impacts. Madam Chair, I do want to make note that there's a long list of supporters, including Taxpayers for Common Sense, National Wildlife Federation, National Association of Counties, American Society of Civil Engineers, and many, many others that are supportive of this bill, and I want to thank the opportunity to work with Ms. Davids on this. One of many bills we worked on with her. I urge adoption of legislation and yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Davids for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. And would love to say thank you to our chairman and ranking member for bringing this up for a markup today. HR 7242, the Community Disaster Resilience Zones Act. It is a mouthful. I'd also thank you to Representative Garrett Graves from Louisiana for introducing this piece of bipartisan legislation with me. I have certainly appreciated his dedication and that of his staff on the issue of resilience. So the CDRZ, or CDRS is what we've been calling it, is a straightforward idea that's going to help us use a data-driven approach to identify and improve resilience for our communities that are most at risk of natural disasters, like those in Kansas that face the threat of flooding, tornadoes, and prolonged winter storms. In Wyandotte County, Kansas, for instance, there are vulnerable communities that are faced with very high tornado risk and also high socioeconomic vulnerability. The CDRS Act could result in these communities being identified as most at need and most at risk, given a CDRZ Act designation. And that kind of support and resources would help improve resilience against things like tornado risk. The overarching CDRS proposal includes bills that create new resilience project bonds, tax credits, and incentives for philanthropic giving to bring as many public and private sector resources to bear as possible. This bill is the foundational infrastructure for that larger vision and starts to help with the most at-risk communities so they can improve their resilience efforts by strengthening existing programs. So I urge and would ask that our colleagues support this. And with that, I will yield back.
Thank you. Do any other members wish to be recognized for statements?
Just briefly.
Mr. Larson for 5 minutes.
Chair Titus, thank you. I'll just comment briefly. Certainly in Washington State, we think wildfires, wildfire resilience, but last November in the north part of Western Washington State, the communities there experienced what the weather folks called atmospheric rivers. According to FEMA, there were 3 separate events, but if you lived there, it was one long 3-week rainstorm and causing massive flooding in very rural areas without the ability of these folks to recover without the help from local, county, state, and federal assistance. But it is one of these areas that I think we're going to continue to see this kind of thing happen because it's tucked up against the Cascade Mountains where these rivers hit and just dump everything they have left in these small communities. And it seems that this Cedars plan may be greatly applicable, possibly, to helping these communities build resilient infrastructure and recover. So I'm very pleased for the leadership from the co-sponsors on this bill and urge support. Thank you.
Do any other members wish to make a statement? Are there any amendments to the amendment?
Madam Chair. I have an amendment.
Mr. Graves, you have an amendment?
You can go.
Madam Chair, thank you. I have
We'll let the clerk,
designate 188.
thank you. Will the clerk designate the amendment?
Amendment number 1 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7242 offered by Mr. Graves of Louisiana, number 188.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and I'll now recognize Mr. Graves to speak on his amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, in the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018, this committee worked on just really transformative legislation for FEMA. We're not done yet. We have a lot more work to do, but the legislation was really addressed a lot of the most acute issues that we have identified on a bipartisan basis in this committee that have prevented FEMA from doing their job efficiently. One of the things that we included in this legislation was Section 1210, and it was known as duplication of benefits. And what's happened is that there was this really flawed provision in law that said that if you got a loan from the Small Business Administration in the aftermath of a disaster, you would be ineligible for a grant if those became available later. Madam Chair, we've talked about this issue in this committee dozens of times. Think for just a minute, if you had a constituent that leaned forward, they were totally devastated, their house was flooded, maybe even destroyed, and it was the only place they had to live, and they had a family. So what did they do? They sat there and they busted their rear. They went out there and found any resources they could to go rebuild their home because that was home. They needed a place for their family to live. And the only funds that were available, because as you know, automatically the Small Business Administration comes in and makes loans available to disaster-impacted individuals or families. And so they went ahead and got the loan. Unbeknownst to them, 6 months, maybe a year later, they end up being grants available because Congress got off its rear and actually appropriated funds, and finally they published a Federal Register notice and those funds became available. So if one family worked their butts off and they rebuilt that home and borrowed money and did everything they need to do, they tapped their retirement, and another family sat there in a FEMA-supplied hotel room or a FEMA-supplied trailer or other housing, the second family that benefited from the taxpayers by paying for that hotel room, that trailer, or that other housing, temporary housing, the family that already has caused FEMA to incur perhaps hundreds of thousands of dollars, they also are eligible for a grant. The family that took the loan, they don't get anything. So we fixed this in 2018. We fixed it in the law. In fact, it passed through the House of Representatives 4 times on a bipartisan basis before we were able to get the Senate to act on this, only to have both the previous administration and the current administration generate guidance that is inconsistent with what we wrote in the law that says that only certain people are eligible. And so let me be clear. These are dollars that were already appropriated to the state of Louisiana. We're not asking that additional funds be appropriated, that federal taxpayers incur any more liability or expense. All it is is making sure that disaster victims that took out loans, that leaned forward, that were proactive, that didn't take the FEMA hotel room for the extended period of time, that didn't take the FEMA trailer or the housing for extended period of times, that they be treated just like anybody else. And because of the flawed interpretation of the previous administration, the bogus interpretation that's being maintained under this administration, we once again have to come back and re-legislate and say, this time I mean it, which is one of the most frustrating things about serving in Congress. I feel like we do this all the time with FEMA, the Corps of Engineers, and others. So, Madam Chair, this amendment simply makes it very clear that if you got a loan, it does not make you ineligible for a grant. And let me say this one more time because I want to be very clear. When we appropriate funds for disaster grants, we appropriate a lump sum, that's it. I am not asking, this amendment does not cause federal taxpayers to incur an additional penny. It simply allows these people to be eligible for grants for funds that are already available to states. That's it. And this is exactly what this committee intended in 2018. And it's ridiculous that we've had to come in and re-legislate on this thing. I think I passed amendments on the House floor on this 4 different times since this became law, trying to fix this. And it really is just unjust what's happening right now. Yield back.
Thank you. Does anyone else wish to speak on this amendment? Are there amendments to the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor?
Madam Chair.
Oh, excuse me.
Madam Chair, if I respect you as the subcommittee chair, and I just want to ask if you would give me a commitment that we find a venue, whether it's this legislation or something later. If you give us a commitment that you'll work with us to ensure that congressional intent is preserved in what we did in 2018, I'd be willing to withdraw this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. We work well on other subjects. I don't see why we couldn't do this also. You make very compelling arguments. We shouldn't have to re-legislate the same issues. So let us work together and see what we can do.
Madam Chair, I ask unanimous consent that Graves number 1 be withdrawn.
That's fine. Thank you. I'll now call up MAST number 097's amendment.
Madam Chair,
Will the clerk designate the amendment?
I have 2 amendments, 097, 098. I'm willing to withdraw 097 if you want to move to 098.
All right, thank you, Mr. Mast. Then we'll go to MAST 098, if the clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 4 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute of HR 7242 offered by Mr. Mast, number 098.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. I recognize Mr. Mast to speak on his amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, there are harmful algal blooms, toxic algal blooms. They affect different communities around the country in a myriad of ways. In the state of Florida, they have been determined to be emergencies. They've been declared emergencies at different times. My own community has been affected by literally toxic algal blooms at some points 9 out of a dozen years in a row. And what this amendment would direct FEMA to do would be to establish criteria for determining the damage that's caused by these toxic, harmful algal blooms, which affect communities in different ways, as I already said, and establish that criteria for determining the damage, right? We deal with FEMA, with Stafford, with a host of different kinds of damage, from natural disasters, mostly like mudslides and hurricanes and fires and things like that. But what you have in some places with these algal blooms is you have disaster being caused year after year by the hand of the federal government. The hand of the federal government is creating the disaster. And I will use my own community as the specific example for this, where the EPA determined these algal blooms, microcystin that's in them, is toxic at 8 parts per billion. On this lake in Florida, Lake Okeechobee, last year it reached the level of 800 plus parts per billion. So well above the level that the EPA said human beings, too toxic, don't come and touch it. Let's make some comparisons about this, right? Chlorine, if there's chlorine in your water, 4 parts per billion, above that, it's considered too toxic, right? If it would be like having water with chlorine that's 400 parts per billion, that would be a comparative. Or Flint, Michigan with lead, where, lead in water doesn't really reach a trigger point until 15 parts per billion. They had 200 to 10,000 parts per billion in the water in Flint, Michigan. Those were things that are disasters. So this is the way that this is a disaster in my community and many others, and we need FEMA to establish that criteria to determine how damage is caused in that way. And just to say a little bit more about how this is ridiculous with the Army Corps of Engineers, who, at least in my community, takes these algal blooms, channelizes them into canals where they are then released into more populated areas, condensing them and doing damage that no other person can do. If you are coastal and you want to put in a dock or do any construction along the water, you would have to mitigate every bit of seagrass that a piling in the water would touch. But in our community, the Corps of Engineers comes in, dumps these toxic waters into our community, and wipes out, like a forest fire underneath the water, thousands of acres of seagrass without having to mitigate a bit of it. That would be an example of how I could construe it as a disaster, and how the Corps of Engineers is backward on this. Or you take something like turtles. You can't go out there and test and touch turtle eggs or the nests or things like that on the beach. But we have turtles that literally die suspended in these toxic algal blooms that are released by the hand of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Or dolphins in the waterways. You can't go out there on your boat and look for dolphins going gracefully through the waves and try to pet them on the side of your boat. You'd be breaking the law. But the Corps of Engineers can release toxic waters in there and see these dolphins killed, washed up on shore, their source of food, the seagrass, absolutely wiped out. Those are disaster things. Things like dogs being killed from that. And then to make one other point of another way that this is a disaster for many and why FEMA needs to make these determinations, I spoke a little bit about Flint already and the water, the drinking water supply in Flint. Well, in Florida, Lake Okeechobee, where these algal blooms measured 800 parts per billion, 100 times 100x too toxic just last year, this time last year. That is a primary drinking water supply for a number of cities that sit on that lake. It is a secondary drinking water supply for a number of other cities that sit off that lake, like the city of West Palm Beach, and it's water measuring 100 times too toxic at some times for human beings to come in contact with. So, for a host of different reasons, FEMA needs to go out there, establish criteria for determining the damage caused by these harmful toxic algal blooms. Madam Chair, I thank you for the indulgence of speaking on this, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Mast. Do any other members wish to be recognized to speak on the amendment? Well, then I'll recognize myself. I support your amendment, Mr. Mast. Harmful algal blooms can have a devastating impact on the ecology and the economy of coastal communities. This committee has heard from many stakeholders that FEMA programs are not adequately designed to measure the impacts of hazards like harmful algal blooms or extreme heat, extreme cold, which don't actually cause property damage. Climate change has increased the impact of these hazards, and it's time for FEMA to catch up and consider how they will adapt. The study is a reasonable approach to guiding FEMA in the direction of adjusting its programs so they will be able to measure the impact of and learn how to respond to these hazards. I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment. Are there amendments to the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question is now on adoption and favorably reporting H.R. 7242 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is, as amended, is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 2020, the Post-Disaster Assistance Online Accountability Act. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management is discharged from further consideration of H.R. 2020. I call the bill up for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for a statement on H.R. 2020. Introduced by Congresswoman Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, H.R. 2020 would create a new system of tracking federal disaster projects and assistance by establishing a single online repository for information related to projects and spending. When a major disaster strikes, the American people should know how and where their disaster funds are being spent without having to wade through reams of governmental paperwork. This legislation simplifies the data collection process for federal disaster recovery projects. Everything we hear is that this is what we need to do, cut some of the red tape. To increase transparency to the public, the bill would also create a page on usaspending.gov for the public to track agency disaster recovery activities and the amount of assistance expended by any agency on a quarterly basis. Federal agencies need to be accountable to the victims of disasters so that those victims can have peace of mind when they are at their most vulnerable. I support this legislation, and I would ask my colleagues to do the same. I now recognize Mr. Graves for a statement. Oh, I'm sorry. Where did you come from?
We're playing twins today.
You are, Mr. Rouser.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a good bill. It will increase transparency for post-disaster federal assistance. It requires all agencies that provide federal disaster assistance to update a central website quarterly. This increased transparency will allow the public to see where their taxpayer dollars are going and which areas are receiving the most federal assistance for post-disaster recovery. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rouser. Does any other member wish to be recognized for a statement? I now recognize Mr. Webster, ranking member, for a statement.
Thank you, Chair. I would just say ditto. It's a good bill and urge my colleagues to support it. Yield back.
Madam Chair?
Oh, Ms. Gonzalez Colon, are you there, or do you wish to be recognized?
Yes, yes,
Right.
ma'am, I wish to be recognized.
Well, thank you. You're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Ranking Member Graves today, Ranking Member Rouser for being here, and thank you to Chairman DeFazio for including my bill, HR 2020, in today's markup. This bill, which is the Post-Disaster Assistance Online Accountability Act, will provide, as you just mentioned, an innovative and comprehensive approach to tracking federal disaster projects and assistance. I thank you, all of you, for supporting this bill. It will establish a single one repository to report information about federal disaster assistance and provide transparency to American taxpayers. Working in collaboration with the Project of Government Oversight to develop this bipartisan bill, the underlying legislation will establish a subpage for transparency of disaster assistance on usaspending.gov that will better inform the general public about the status of disaster funding. It will also require agencies that offered disaster assistance, including the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Small Business Administration, and others, to submit information to the Office of Management Budget to ensure that the data is available on the usaspending.gov website. This data would include the amount of disaster assistance provided by the agency every 3 months, the amount of disaster assistance expended or obligated to projects or activities. And this is important because many people, after what happened on the island and many other places in the nation, wait until press or leaders, governmental officials, actually speak about this. So it will include also a detailed list of all projects or activities for which disaster assistance dispersed by the agency was expended, obligated, or used. And I think this year marks the 5th anniversary of Hurricane Irma and Maria, which devastated Puerto Rico. And this legislation will enable my constituents, local mayors and legislators and non-governmental organizations as well, to know what funding has been used for, where the funding will go, and how much funding is left to be spent. I think this is the most important information regarding the recovery process of any state, in this case, Puerto Rico. It will also ensure that streams of funding are not forgotten about or underutilized. It will also provide essential transparency, providing better congressional oversight for disaster recovery. And again, I want to say thank you to the full committee and to the subcommittee chair and ranking members, again, for marking up this legislation. And I urge a yes vote for all my colleagues, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Gonzalez Colon. Does anyone else wish to be recognized for a statement? Are there any amendments to H.R. 2020? The question is on the adoption and favorable reporting of H.R. 2020 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 5703, the Post-Disaster Mental Health Response Act. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management is discharged from further consideration of H.R. 5703. I call the bill up for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for a statement on H.R. 5703. Introduced by Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, H.R. 5703 will make it possible for states, tribes, and territories to request FEMA's crisis counseling assistance to benefit the survivors of emergencies. Currently, the Stafford Act only authorizes FEMA to provide crisis counseling assistance to survivors of major disaster declarations. But in the last decade alone, there have been more than 4,000 emergency declarations in 37 states for incidents including hurricanes, earthquakes, and terrorist attacks. Might include wildfires in that. Most notably, the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing and the 2021 Surfside building collapse received emergency declarations and have led to lasting trauma for the survivors. This legislation will ensure that survivors and communities of disasters that receive emergency declarations can still receive the critical mental health support they need, even though the entire incident doesn't meet the physical or monetary requirements for a major disaster declaration. I support this legislation and would ask my colleagues to do the same. I now recognize Ranking Member Rouser for a statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This bill extends the professional counseling services available to victims of major disaster declarations to emergency disaster declaration victims as well. And as we've seen, disasters can have a profound impact on victims, and this is another tool to help assist their recovery. I urge support of this legislation, and I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Ranking Member Webster for a statement.
Thank you, Chair. This H.R. 5703 is a bipartisan bill, and gets people services when they need them, not just in major disasters, but every disaster. And I think it's a good bill. I support it. I urge my colleagues to do the same. Yield back.
Thank you. Do any other members wish to be recognized for statements?
Madam Chair, Mr. Lynch.
Oh, Mr. Lynch, thank you. Be recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I won't take that long. I just want to be recorded in support of Ms. Presley's bill. I actually represented part of Boston during the marathon bombing. I certainly understand how on some occasions we might have, forest fires or other disasters where psychological counseling may be a great benefit to those people who are suffering in that situation. So I just want to be recorded in full support of my colleague's bill, and I urge my colleagues to do likewise. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lynch. Are there any other members who wish to be recognized? Are there any amendments to H.R. 5703? The question is on the adoption and favorable reporting of H.R. 5703 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed?
Aye.
Thank you. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 7211, the Small State and Rural Act. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management is discharged from further consideration of H.R. 7211, and I call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for a statement on H.R. 7211. Introduced by Representative John Katko, H.R. 7211 amends the Stafford Act to expand the ability of FEMA's Small State Rural Advocate to assist small states and rural communities with disaster funding applications. When disaster strikes the heart of a small or rural community, a significant percentage of the overall housing stock is often damaged or destroyed. However, the community's size may make the total dollar amount of damage seem too low for FEMA to authorize federal assistance. This legislation will enable the Small State Rural Advocate to better help states demonstrate localized impact when applying for federal disaster aid by directing the advocate to consider the impacted jurisdictions' per capita income, poverty status, percentage of the population receiving supplemental nutrition assistance program benefits, and percentage of the population receiving supplemental security income, among other factors. I support this legislation and would ask my colleagues to do the same, and I now recognize Ranking Member Rouser for a statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And this is a really good bill that will help a lot of people in a lot of places. It specifies that small state and rural advocates help collect and present information that is vital for rural and small communities in a disaster declaration. Small and rural communities, they often, as we all know, don't have the capacity to navigate the cumbersome emergency declaration process on their own. By requiring the small state and rural advocate to collect this information will help ensure that these communities' needs are accurately represented in the disaster declaration process so that they can get the timely assistance that they need. Many of the communities in so many of our districts will benefit from this additional resource, and I thank the gentleman for his leadership on this issue, Mr. Katko. I support the bill. Hope everyone will vote for it, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rouser. I now recognize Subcommittee Ranking Member Webster for a statement.
Thank you, Chair. This bill would allow small communities, which already have trouble getting help, to get help, and they get it when they need it, and it'll be a great burden lifter for a lot of those small communities, small rural communities who are just left out. And I support this bill totally and ask my colleagues to do the same. I yield back.
Thank you. Do any other members wish to be recognized for statements?
Madam Chair.
Mr. Katko, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to thank my colleagues for their supportive comments with respect to H.R. 7211. The community I represent in Central New York is all too familiar with the significant challenges that often come with accessing federal aid in the wake of a disaster. For rural communities along Lake Ontario's southern shore that have faced historic flooding in recent years, navigating the federal disaster declaration process can often prove difficult or even insurmountable. These obstacles present themselves across the country, with local authorities in small states and rural communities often grappling with red tape or struggling to demonstrate the severe localized impact of these incidents. Examples like this demonstrate why FEMA's small state and rural advocate has an important role to play in helping underserved communities access disaster aid. This office is intended to help ensure fair access to FEMA assistance for all disaster-impacted areas, and it is important that Congress reinforce its role in facilitating the delivery of essential resources. This is why I was proud to introduce the Small State and Rural Rescue Act. This legislation takes important steps to expand and codify the responsibilities of FEMA's small state and rural advocate when it comes to helping state and local officials in the wake of a disaster. Additionally, this bill directs GAO to conduct a review of how FEMA mobilizes individual assistance to disaster zones. Measures like this one will go a long way in providing support for the rural communities and small states that many of us represent. I would like to thank my friend, Chairwoman Titus, as well as Representatives Jimenez, Pappas, Guest, and Delgado for partnering on both sides of the aisle with me in this effort. And I urge all of my colleagues to join us in supporting this bill. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Katko. Are there any amendments to H.R. 7211? The question is on the adoption and favorable reporting of H.R. 7211 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. We will now consider 18 General Services Administration Capital Investment and Leasing Program resolutions. I ask unanimous consent to call up the resolutions en bloc and that they be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. I support the 18 GSA resolutions before us today. 4 of these resolutions provide GSA with the authorization needed to repair and update life safety, fire protection, seismic, structural, mechanical, electrical, water, and roof systems in GSA-owned buildings all around the country. These projects are necessary to upgrade systems that have been in place since the buildings were originally constructed. Most of the buildings in GSA's owned portfolio are 50 years old or older, making the structural and life safety systems obsolete and dangerous. 12 of the resolutions authorize GSA to lease space for federal agencies, including DOD, the VA, the FBI, FEMA, NOAA, HHS, and DHS. In almost every example, these are spaces that require security-level functionality, and the agency's missions will not change post-COVID-19. In addition to the repair and alteration resolutions, the committee is authorizing the construction of 2 new U.S. courthouses, one in Hartford, Connecticut, and the other in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I support these resolutions and urge my colleagues to do the same. I now recognize Ranking Member Rouser for a statement.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I support these resolutions in large part and primarily speaking on my own behalf, and as well as I'm sure representative of many others. It would save more than $34.3 million in taxpayer dollars through reductions in rental rates in space. I support the bill, encourage its adoption, and yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Ranking Member Webster.
Thank you, Chair. This is, again, the lease resolutions do save that money, and that's really an awesome thing. And so they just reduced the square footage requirements, and that's really awesome. So I support this and yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. Do any other members wish to be recognized for statements? Are there any amendments to the en bloc resolutions? The question is now on the adoption of the 18 GSA resolutions en bloc. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the 18 resolutions are approved. I now ask unanimous consent that each bill ordered reported today will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute incorporating any amendments adopted. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make all necessary technical, clarifying, and conforming changes to each of the bills ordered reported today to reflect the actions of the committee. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 22, Clause 1, I ask unanimous consent that the chair or his or her designee be authorized to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to go to conference with the Senate on the legislation adopted today or on any similar measure. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the chair, after consultation with the ranking member, has authority to strike or revise any provisions of the bills ordered reported today that would cause a sequential referral to another committee, or that would cause the bills or concurrent resolutions to be subject to a Budget Act or Rule 21 pay-go point of order. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, members have at least 2 calendar days in which to file any supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views on the legislation adopted today. Pursuant to Rule 6 of the Rules of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, the committee notes the presence of a quorum for actions taken on all committee business today. With that, the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure has completed its business and the committee is adjourned.